Good evening again, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, distinguished guests, consuls general, commissioners, ministers of government. In particular, all the students from various universities who have come to this lecture. When I invited Angela Davis to this lecture, after being with her on a panel this summer at Syracuse University, she indicated then that she was pleased to know that we had an Eric E. Williams lecture, and that she would be honored to be part of such distinguished company, and indeed that her paper would engage some of Williams's ideas in capitalism and slavery as it relates to the prison industrial complex. Join us this evening, therefore, as we welcome Angela Davis to South Florida, as we honor her, as we mark the contributions of Dr. Eric Williams, former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago and consummate historian himself, originator of a unique technique of, as Erica reminded me yesterday during an interview, of bringing knowledge for the masses, or to the masses, in his University of Whitford Square model, which we only minutely emulate this evening.
It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Angela Davis is a distinguished professor of the History of Consciousness Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She studied at the Frankfurt School in Germany and also attended the University of Paris. She received her bachelor's degree from Brandeis University, her master's degree from the University of California, San Diego, and her PhD in philosophy at the Humboldt University in Berlin. In 1994, she received the distinguished honor of an appointment to the University of California Presidential Chair in African American and Feminist Studies. Among her numerous publications are If They Come in the Morning, Voices of Resistance, Women, Race, and Class, Women, Culture, and Politics, and Are Prisons Obsolete? I had the opportunity to meet Professor Davis in 1982 at the American Federation of Teachers annual convention in Los Angeles. Indeed, that 1982 convention was a significant victory for progressive forces. Some may argue it was significant because the president of the American Federation of Teachers, Albert Schenker, managed to persuade President Ronald Reagan to speak at the convention. But those who make that argument that this was some type of victory because Reagan made his appearance are sadly mistaken. Let us not forget who Reagan was as president. Ronald Reagan was a union buster. He destroyed PACO, the union representing the air traffic controllers, when those workers went on strike demanding better working conditions. He led a fierce campaign against civil rights by appointing anti-civil rights judges, opposing civil rights legislation, leading a crusade against affirmative action, and pushing the, quote, colorblind notion. He was a supporter of the racist apartheid regime in South Africa. His policy of constructive engagement did nothing to challenge the racist regime, while at the same time he was mining the harbors of Nicaragua and invading Grenada, helping to topple the New Deal movement. Thank you. Okay. But the most important event, I would like to also note that we organized teachers and we managed to walk out of that convention. But the most important event and victory for progressive forces at the convention was the appearance of Angela Davis, who spoke at the AFT Black Caucus annual luncheon. I was on the planning committee that invited Professor Davis to speak at that luncheon, and I'll never forget her opening remarks. She said to an overflowing crowd that attended the event, quote, "Imagine, here I am speaking at the same convention that Ronald Reagan spoke." Undoubtedly, her presence at the convention was a victory. You see, my friends, just 10 years earlier, when he served as governor of California, Reagan, as well as other right-wing forces in this country, wanted to silence the voice of Angela Davis, not because of the chumped-up charges that they had leveled against her, accusing her of assisting in a prison breakout, but because she was one of the powerful voices of a monumental movement for liberation in the United States and elsewhere. So her presence at that 1982 convention was historic and a major victory against those who tried to silence her. Today, Angela Davis is without a doubt one of the most preeminent public intellectuals. Her numerous books, as I noted, and articles have raised our consciousness and motivated many to struggle for social change. But it is not only Angela Davis's writings that impress millions in and outside of the United States, but her continuing activism for social justice. In an article entitled Masked Racism, Reflections on the Prison Industrial Complex, Professor Davis writes, quote, "Prisons do not disappear problems, they disappear human beings. And the practice of disappearing vast numbers of people from poor, immigrant, and racially marginalized communities has literally become big business." Tonight, Professor Davis will speak to us about this new form of slavery known as the prison industrial complex. Professor Davis.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I feel extremely moved and honored to be in the presence of such a distinguished audience, including the members of the community and students who were not able to get in this evening. And I should say that it is indeed an honor to have been invited to deliver the 5th annual Eric Williams Memorial Lecture. And I would like to thank Professor Carol Boyce Davies for having extended this invitation to me. And I'd also like to express my gratitude to Erica Williams-Connell for her role in the development of the Eric Williams Memorial Collection at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago, and for collaborating in the organization of this event. I'm not going to mention all of the other names which you've heard several times. I would simply like to say that this is really a wonderful community building gathering. I have not been to South Florida for a very long time. A very long time. Many of you were probably not born when I was here last. And I must say that I'm absolutely impressed by the spirit of this gathering, by its diversity, and also by the remarks that Consul General Robinson made in indicating his hope that this evening would also be controversial. So I sat there wondering how to make this evening controversial. I hope that we can engage in a conversation about one of the most urgent problems of our time. The prison industrial complex, which increasingly has global dimensions and is linked to the development of transnational capitalism. But first I want to say a few words about Eric Williams. As all of you know, Eric E. Williams, the first Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, was one of the germinal figures in the development of Africana, what we now call Africana studies. His work, together with that of such influential intellectuals as W.E.B. Du Bois, established the groundwork for a new field, which has greatly evolved over the last 30 years. Eric Williams, as you've heard, was also an activist, a public intellectual for whom the quest for global racial and economic justice was always at the core of the scholarly enterprise. My own research has been profoundly influenced by Eric Williams' work. And I'll simply mention the fact that when I wrote the very first article I published, and I wrote it in a jail cell in Northern California. It was an article on the role of women in the slave community. Eric Williams' work, Capitalism and Slavery, was one of the major texts I consulted, and I have to tell you that my lawyers and I had to engage in a protracted fight with the jail authorities before I was allowed to receive this book. Imprisonment and slavery have been two lifelong obsessions of my own activism and research. And so this evening, in honor of Dr. Eric Williams, I want to try to urge you to think about the historical system of slavery and the prison, the institution of the prison together. And specifically, I want us to think about the extent to which the vast global apparatus of imprisonment, and particularly corporate involvement in the business of punishment, that these developments are related to what I would call the sedimented history of slavery we are living out today. In other words, slavery has not yet been completely abolished. And I think it is important for us to learn how to talk about this institution as it affects our lives today. Later, I'll probably make reference to Du Bois's notion of the abolition democracy. That is to say, that the complete abolition of slavery would have required the institution of economic, political, social democracy. And here we are at the beginning of the 21st century, and we cannot yet say that racial democracy, economic democracy, has been extended to people throughout this country, throughout the hemisphere, and throughout the world. I can say that over the last years, there have been important shifts in the way people tend to think about the impact of imprisonment, including what I think is an increasing popularity of the term prison industrial complex. Most of you are familiar with that concept, right? Which would not have been the case 5 years ago. I say this because I think it's always important for us to take note of the victories, even if they're small victories that we win. And in a sense, the era of Ronald Reagan, who's already been invoked during this evening, the Reagan Bush 1 era, I suppose I can say, is precisely the era that gave rise to efforts to disestablish the welfare state, to structural readjustment in the southern region, to a vast transnational capitalist network, and at the same time to a rise in the construction of prisons throughout this country, the beginning of the marketing of the US-style prison on the global market, the beginning of the increase in the numbers of people who are imprisoned in this country, and now we can say that there are over 2 million people living in these obsolete institutions today, institutions that bear the stamp of slavery. But a lot of things have changed over the last few years since that election that was decided in this state. I should take that back. It was the Supreme Court that decided to appoint a non-elected president, I suppose we should say. But I do want to point out the fact that were it not for the disenfranchisement of thousands and thousands of people in this state, and particularly people of African descent in this state, if it were not for the disenfranchisement of this vast group of people under the felony disenfranchisement laws, there would never have been a question of who would be the next president of the United States of America. So when we talk about the prison industrial complex, we're not talking about a single issue. We're talking about a whole network of issues that has critical ramifications for us today. Now, I always think that it's important for us to get a sense of the larger picture before we look very specifically at a particular question, say the relationship between slavery and imprisonment. And so just for a moment, I want to try to evoke some of the things that have happened in the aftermath of that fated election, in the aftermath of the attacks on September 11th, 2001. A great many things in the general political environment have changed. A war, first in Afghanistan, then in Iraq, a war in Iraq which millions of people throughout the world tried desperately to stop. There was an unprecedented transnational demonstration of anti-war sentiment on February 15th last year, when millions of people from this state to California to New York to Europe, there were 2.5 million people in the streets in Rome alone on that day, to South Africa, to Brazil. But we have a president who does not understand. Well, don't let me get started talking about it. I better move on. And I can say that what has happened over the last 2 years is that there has been a legitimization of a kind of diplomacy. We have a lot of diplomats here this evening, and the kind of cowboy diplomacy introduced by George Bush, a president whose every move is choreographed. You were talking about Ronald Reagan. I remember the first time I saw him in person, he had this thick pancake makeup on. But anyway, but it seems to me that Bush relies as much or more on Hollywood stunts and their mobile props that accompany him wherever he goes, mobile stage sets for every presentation he makes. And this is the president under whom the anti-democratic USA Patriot Act was passed. In such a short period of time, we've witnessed the creation of a Department of Homeland Security into which the former INS has been folded. We've seen the arbitrary arrest of vast numbers of immigrants, and particularly immigrants of Middle Eastern and South Asian descent. We've seen a renewed buildup of the military apparatus, the $87 billion recently requested, and that's just a part of the story. I mean, how many jobs could $87 billion provide? How many scholarships and fellowships for students who want to get an education? How much health care? How much housing? We have to keep these things in perspective, always, always. With this renewed buildup of the military apparatus, we see the ominous nuclear component merging once again. And we see a more graphically explicit relationship between the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex. As a matter of fact, many young people of color who join the military as a way of avoiding poverty and imprisonment now find themselves forced to fight this bizarre war against terrorism in countries like Iraq. We've seen the emergence of a new nation, a new multicultural nation. Now, most of us are supposedly included in the embrace of the nation. And many people of African descent, many people of Latino descent were very happy to finally receive the invitation to join the nation. However, the price of admission to this new multicultural nation has been xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, and also homophobia. Well, I think I should move on to the subject, because we could spend the next couple of hours talking about where we are today. But I want to point out, as I was saying before, that many more people now understand the workings of the prison industrial complex. Cell phone. Everybody turn your cell phones off, even if you don't think it's on. I have been doing work around prison issues. I'm not going to tell you how long. Perhaps I should. I think for about, let's see, maybe about 40 years. Yeah, because I became active in the movement to free Nelson Mandela. And then later, the campaign to free the Puerto Rican Lolita Lebron and the Puerto Rican nationalists, Oscar Collazo. So it seems like that's been about 4 decades. I can't believe it. I just now calculated it in my head, so you have to excuse my sense of astonishment. And in the last 5 years or so, I think that we have witnessed the development of a movement that has its roots in the 60s and the 70s, the campaign to free the Soledad brothers, the work that George Jackson did, the incredible intellectual work that he did with respect to thinking about the relationship between the institution of the prison as an institution, not only the imprisonment of political prisoners, but the prison as an institution, and how it has helped to further the structures of racism. And so I think recently we've come to recognize that the prison is precisely one of those institutions in whose structures racism has learned how to hide. And I say this because we often tend to think about racism as attitudinal. We think about it as explicit. We don't necessarily also think about it as being embedded in social and economic and political structures. And if you look at the population of the prison system today, you see that race matters when it comes to determining who gets to go to prison and who doesn't. The vast majority of people in prison today are people of color. Black people, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans. Native Americans constitute the highest per capita portion of the prison population. That is to say, more Native Americans per capita go to prison than any other group. And women. Women generally get left out when we talk about the prison problem, right? But it's important for us to recognize that women, not only in this country, but in other parts of the world as well, constitute the fastest growing sector of the imprisoned population. And among women, it is black women who have the fastest growing rate of imprisonment than any other group of people in this society. If we don't have a relative behind walls, or sometimes even if we do, we tend not to think about this as a space inhabited by ever larger numbers of people who have been declared the detritus of contemporary global capitalism. That is to say, they are dispensable. They don't matter. Their jobs have been taken away from them. The possibility of an education has been taken away from them. Health care has been denied them, even though with the last president we were supposed to have health care insurance for all. You remember the Clinton? Whatever happened to that? Vast numbers of people are in prison because they can't afford to get mental health care. And the jail and the prison become the dumping grounds for people who have severe emotional and mental problems. Now, which brings me to talk about, which brings me to the subject of what we should do about this. Most people tend to characterize the solution as prison reform. Have you heard that term? That's the term that everybody uses. It rolls off everybody's lips with such facility that even though I personally have never characterized myself as a prison reformer, not in the 40 years I've been doing work around this issue, I'm constantly defined as a prison reformer. I don't believe in the reform of the prison as an institution. I believe it needs to be abolished. Which is not to say that conditions should not change within existing prisons, because there are over 2 million people who live horrendous lives. Conditions need to change, but not for the purpose of reforming the institution, but for the purpose of providing more humane conditions of habitation for the people who have been so unfortunate as to live out sometimes the most important years of their lives in prison. Now, prison abolition, that's controversial, is it? Is that controversial? Okay, all right. Now, and I want that to be the theme of the remainder of my remarks. And this is the connection with slavery. And I want you to, for a moment, think about the impact of the notion of the abolition of slavery 200 years ago. Imagine how people responded when the question of the abolition of this institution of slavery was raised. And not just the white people. I imagine that there were probably many black people who were slaves here and other parts of the hemisphere who could not imagine life, who could not imagine that it would be possible to abolish this institution. So what are the conditions of possibility for the abolition of entrenched social institutions? I'm actually interested in the connections between the anti-slavery abolitionist movement, the anti-death penalty abolitionist movement, and the anti-prison abolitionist movement. It seems to me that there are historical connections. It seems to me that the number one priority on the reparations agenda ought to be to abolish the death penalty. But how can we think the death penalty in connection with reparations for slavery? That's the question, right? What kind of argument can we make that would persuade people that in order to develop an agenda for reparations against slavery, we have to think about the death penalty as absolutely central? Well, what I can say, and unfortunately, we don't have too much more time, but what I can say is that had not it been for slavery, the death penalty would more than likely have been abolished in the United States of America. Slavery became a haven for the death penalty. And precisely as a matter of fact, when the prison was invented, as U.S. American democracy was emerging, the prison was supposed to be a democratic institution, a form of punishment that was particularly related to a society of people who had rights, who were rights-bearing subjects. Because what does imprisonment do? It deprives you of rights. That is what the notion of imprisonment as punishment. It's predicated on the assumption that people who are in prison are individuals who have rights that can be taken away from them. Now, before people were recognized as having rights, it didn't make sense to use imprisonment as punishment. And so imprisonment emerges as punishment. I'm not talking about imprisonment per se. I'm talking about imprisonment as punishment. Do the time, the calculation of punishment in terms of time, which interestingly enough is very much related to the calculation of the value of the commodity, but that's probably a subject for another lecture. But we want to talk about the connection with capitalism here. So the prison, the penitentiary, was supposed to supplant capital punishment. It was supposed to be a democratic alternative for capital and corporal punishment. And as a matter of fact, for white people in this country, the emergence of the penitentiary did mean that most offenses that had been previously capital were decapitalized, and that corporal punishment was eventually abolished. But where did capital punishment continue to exist? Where did corporal punishment continue to take place? Under slavery. And so, as a matter of fact, the abolitionists, when they gave their amazing speeches against slavery, almost inevitably pointed to the question of the barbarity of punishment that continued to exist under slavery, and the differential punishment. Frederick Douglass, Lydia Maria Child, many others constantly pointed out that in a state like Virginia, there was only one offense for which a white person could be sentenced to death, but there were 66 offenses for which a slave could be sentenced to death. And so, when slavery was abolished, capital punishment was not. Capital punishment persists to this day. And I think that we all recognize the degree to which racism has a lot to do with the continuation of capital punishment, but we oftentimes think about the race of the individuals who have been sentenced to death, or with Baldus and all, there have been those race of victim studies, We think about the race of the individual. We haven't yet learned how to think in terms of structures. The death penalty, the continuation of the existence of capital punishment, is itself a racist phenomenon, regardless of the race of those individuals who are upon whom the death penalty is visited. Capital punishment is a legacy of slavery. It's a sediment of slavery. I mean, why is it that the United States of America is the only country, what did they say, the only industrialized country that continues to use capital punishment as a routine way of addressing the certainly very difficult problem, some of the difficult problems we have in the society. But I think it is important to see the capital punishment itself as a legacy of slavery. And imprisonment as another kind of death. Imprisonment as civil death. As a matter of fact, if we think about Orlando Patterson's studies of the social death of slavery, we can talk about the social death of slavery, we can talk about the corporeal death of capital punishment, and the civil death of imprisonment. That's why Bush is in the White House today, because so many people in Florida are civilly dead. They have suffered civil death. Now, what can we do about this? What can we do? In Black Reconstruction, W.E.B. Du Bois argued that the abolition of slavery meant not simply abolition of legal ownership of the slave. It meant the uplift of slaves and their eventual incorporation into the body civil, politic, and social of the United States. The Negro must have civil rights as a citizen. He must eventually have political rights like every other citizen. Now, if you consider the fact that most 19th century abolitionist groups assume that their task was done when the 13th Amendment was passed, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. Du Bois, when he used this term abolition democracy, pointed out that the mere abstract abolition of slavery would lead to an equally abstract freedom and would allow the system of racial domination that developed under slavery to haunt the future. And the contemporary movement for reparations is founded on what has been called the unfinished revolution of Reconstruction. If we rethink this notion of the unfinished work of abolition democracy through the lens of punishment, what we can say is that the failure to recognize the project of abolition as involving more than the dismantling of slavery as a particularly brutal regime which sustained an economic system based on the ownership of laboring bodies, a penal regime whose presumed irrationality was in part constructed by the opposition to the new regime of the penitentiary. this created the historical conditions for the very survival of modes of punishment associated with slavery. These modes of punishment are in contradiction to what we might call the project of rehabilitative justice, which always rises phoenix-like from the debris of prison crisis. Everybody's familiar with the term color blindness, right? And you know, some of you may know about what's happening in California. I won't talk about, you know, total recall, but you know, I will say that there is a proposition that has been introduced by one of the black members of the Board of Regents of the University of California, Ward Connolly, who spent some time down here last year, all right, out here. But color blindness, that's the watchword. I would like to propose a different term, and this term has to do with the law. I would like to call this judicial deracialization, okay? Because if we think about the extent to which the development of this discourse of colorblindness in the law has served to hide some of the worst forms of racism that are allowed then to proliferate because we have no vocabulary with which to talk about them. If you go into prison, how many of you have been into prisons? I didn't say been to prison, I said been. You see, the first question, when I asked that question, how many of you have been in prison? And hardly anybody wants to raise their hand. There are various ways of being in prison, right? You know, one can go to visit a relative. But if you see, if you go into virtually any prison in the South, you are immediately struck by the visual impact of virtually all black and Latino prison populations. Now that's enough to evoke the ghost of slavery. You know, every time I go into a prison, particularly in the southern United States, I feel as if I have returned to that historical moment. Now, many of these practices have hemorrhaged into the systems outside of the South and have brought the impact of racism not only on the historical victims of these punishments, but also on other racialized communities, including white people. This is why I think we have to learn how to talk about the impact of structural racism on poor communities. If you go into a prison, you will very rarely find a wealthy person. The white people in prison are going to be very poor. So there's a way in which we have to be able to talk about the impact of racism on poor white people, structural racism. Now, I need to conclude because there's some other events scheduled this evening, I think, or other agendas on the program. Okay, well, let me say a few words about prison abolition. Let me conclude with that, and with a story. Because I know that the question that most of you have is, well, what are you going to replace it with, right? If you abolish the prison, what are you going to replace it with? I want to ask you to think about the same question in relation to slavery. If you abolish slavery, what are you going to replace it with? Exactly, exactly. I'm asking you to try to think about the abolition of the institution of the prison in a different way, and not to force your imagination to try to come up with a solution that fits the footprint of the prison. Do you understand what I'm saying? It makes no sense to think about another institution that is simply going to replace the prison. No sense. As a matter of fact, the term prison industrial complex allows us to think about the project of abolition in much broader terms. The prison industrial complex is not the sum of all the jails and prisons in this country and throughout the world. It is a set of symbiotic relationships among correctional communities, transnational corporations, media conglomerates, guards unions, legislative and court agendas. Of the increasing transnational incarnations of the prison industrial complex, the most dramatic is the insinuation of US-style anti-crime rhetoric into the new democracy of South Africa, and the erection of a US-style super maximum security prison, as well as the spread of private prisons in South Africa, private prisons owned and operated by corporations that are headquartered in the United States of America. And of course, the largest private prison company, the largest transnational private prison country is Corrections Corporation of America, which got started in Nashville, Tennessee. And until recently, CCA owned and operated the largest women's prison in the country of Australia. Now, if we accept the fact that the contemporary meaning of punishment is fashioned through these various relationships, then our abolitionist strategies will propose alternatives that try to pull these relationships apart. Does that make sense? What would it mean then to imagine a system in which punishment is not allowed to become the source of corporate profit? How can we imagine a society in which race and class are not primary determinants of punishment? Or one in which punishment itself is no longer the central concern in the making of justice? Rather than try to imagine a single alternative to the existing system of incarceration, we might envision an array of alternatives. Education can be seen as the most compelling alternative to imprisonment. And so what we would have to do is demilitarize our schools, revitalize education at all levels. Unless the current structures of violence are eliminated from schools in impoverished communities of color, including the presence of armed guards, armed security guards and police, and unless schools become places that encourage the joy of learning, these schools will remain the major conduits to youth prisons and then to adult prisons. Alternatives that fail to address racism, male dominance, homophobia, class bias, and other structures of domination will not lead to decarceration and will not advance the goal of abolition. I want to conclude with a story, the story of Amy Beale. Many of you are familiar with her. And I'm doing this in lieu of evoking the growing body of literature on reshaping systems of justice around strategies of reparation rather than retribution. In 1993, when South Africa was on the cusp of its transition, Amy Beale was devoting a significant amount of her time as a foreign student to the work of rebuilding South Africa. Nelson Mandela had been freed in 1990, but he had not yet been elected president. On August 25th, 1993, Beale was driving several black friends to their home in Guguletu. Beale was a white student from Newport Beach, California, Fulbright student. A crowd shouting anti-white slogans confronted her, and some of them stoned and stabbed her to death. 4 of the men, and of course they were all black, participating in the attack were convicted of her murder and were sentenced to 18 years in prison. In 1997, Amy's mother and father, Peter and Linda Beale, were persuaded finally to support the amnesty petition the men presented to, 2 of the men presented to the all 4 presented to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They apologized to the Beales and they were released from prison in 1998. But 2 of them, Easy Nofumela and Ntobeko Payne, wanted to meet the parents of the young woman they killed. They said they wanted to say more about their own sorrow for killing the Beale's daughter than had been possible during the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. I know, Nofumela says, he said, I know you lost a person you love. I want you to forgive me and take me as your child. The Beales had established the Amy Beale Foundation in the aftermath of their daughter's death. So they asked the 2 men, Nofumela and Payne, to work at the Guguletu branch of the foundation. Nofumela became an instructor in an after-school sports program, and Payne became an administrator. In June 2002, a little more than a year ago, the 2 of them accompanied Linda Beale to New York, where they all spoke before the American Family Therapy Academy on reconciliation and restorative justice. In a Boston Globe interview, Linda Beale, when asked how she now feels about the men who killed her daughter, said, I have a lot of love for them. After Peter Beale died in 2002, last year, she bought 2 plots of land for the 2 of them in memory of her husband so that Nofumela and Payne can build their own homes. A few days after the September 11th attacks, the Beales had been asked to speak at a synagogue in Newport Beach. According to Peter Beale, and I'm ending with this quote, we try to explain that sometimes it pays to shut up and listen to what other people have to say, to ask, why do these terrible things happen, instead of simply reacting. Thank you.
Now what you've been waiting for, questions and answers.
Yes, I agree with the sentiments that Dr. Angela Davis said about the prevention of going to prison. But the question is, when some people slip through the cracks and don't get the education, etc., and they commit heinous crimes, what would she suggest that we do with those people? And secondly, the one crime that you said white people used to be condemned to death for, what was that?
Okay, I'll answer the last part of your question first. What do you think it was? Yeah. And what do you think the 66, this was in the state of Virginia, the 66 offenses for which slaves could be put to death? Yeah, just about anything. Yeah, the question you raised initially is an important one. And the reason I ended with that story about Amy Beale was because I wanted to encourage you to think about the tendency that we all have to use the worst possible example as a justification for the entire institution. Yes, some people do terrible things. Yes, some people probably cannot live in communities where they may do harm to other people. But I think that we need to think about those kinds of questions in a framework that is not overdetermined by the death penalty and the existence of the prison. If in South Africa everyone had been imprisoned who had ever committed an act that was against the law, probably everybody in South Africa would be behind bars today. And this is why they had to come up with a very different kind of solution. And I'm not saying it was a perfect solution, but the idea of reconciliation, of reparation, is something that we have to think about seriously, as opposed to immediately going to the question, well, what do we do with the murderers and rapists? Because that's what we're schooled to do. That's the first question we think about. So what I'd like us to do is to ask ourselves, why is that the first question? And by raising that question, we forget about, all of the people, the majority of people who are in prison who have not committed violent acts, the vast numbers of people who are in on drug charges, whereas, as I've said many times, in venues like this, we see increasing numbers of advertisements of commercials on television encouraging people to take drugs to make themselves feel better. So I really think it's important to think about the contradictions. And then in that context, try to figure out, what to do with those people who might indeed present a major danger to their communities. Anybody else? How long are we going to do the, I think people would probably like to know. So about 10, okay.
I'm going to have to ask Heather to come back to the stage. It's a violation of protocol, essentially not to read the governor's letter, and I think she needs to do that.
Yeah, I wanted to hear what he had to say.
Boo! Boo!
Well, I guess there is what the majority wants, and then there are the official regulations, and we have to. Dear friends, this is from Governor Bush. Dear friends, it is a pleasure to extend greetings to all attending the 5th Annual Florida International University Eric E. Williams Memorial Lecture. I understand the speaker will be Angela Davis, the celebrated civil and women rights activist. I commend FIU's Department of African New World Studies and the Eric Williams Memorial Collection at the University of the West Indies, Trinidad and Tobago for their dedication and commitment to share the library archives of the late Dr. Eric Eustace Williams. We are appreciative of the contributions Caribbean people have made to today's world as we know it, and I encourage you to continue to share the rich history of the Caribbean people. Best wishes for an enjoyable and successful event. Sincerely, Jeb Bush.
Well, you see, one of the things we might do is to ask your Governor Bush to make a major contribution to the Eric Williams Memorial Collection. If he believes that Caribbean people have made an important contribution to the world, then yeah, don't you think? Isn't that right? Okay. And I won't say anything else.
Okay, let's move on, folks. We've gotten that out of the way. Yep.
Dr. Davis, just to indulge my whim here, very recently it's been a trend within, I know probably the entire state of Florida, where the good governor has saw it fit to cut roughly $13 million from the Bright Future Scholarship, which it gives educational opportunities to minorities, particularly Latinos and blacks. And they have sought to increase funding for the buildings of prisons within the state of Florida. I realize our delegates here, would you point out if just one key factor that you can try and impart on them to maybe say, start diverting more money to schools, to after-school programs to help, bolster, just bolster the minds of people nowadays, especially the young people.
Yeah, thank you so much for raising that, because this is increasingly a trend. There are movements, campaigns that are developing, that have developed across the country, that bring prison activists together with teachers, parents of children who are in school, who are organized with education activists. And some of the slogans that have emerged are schools, not jails, education, not incarceration. I don't know, where are you? Oh, there you are, okay. I'm not sure that it's possible to persuade some people with rational argumentation. I don't think that there's some people who are immune. And then there's some people who don't understand. I won't name any names. I think what we have to do is develop movements. And I don't use that term lightly. When I say social movements, radical social movements, I'm not talking about transplanting the 60s to the 21st century. I'm talking about building the kinds of movements that have become possible with new developments in technology, that have become possible with the transnational circuits of community. I think that these movements need to move from the very local level, and perhaps even school-based campaigns, to the transnational level. I think this is the only way we will bring about change during this period. And as I was talking to a young person before the lecture began, excuse me, I think we have to take the notion of movement seriously. A movement is not a demonstration. We should take demonstrations seriously. And it's important for all of us to be out there on that one day to demonstrate the fact that we are organizing a movement. But the demonstration is not the movement. In this era of instant everything, fast food and instant knowledge, everything can be Googled, right? You want an answer, Google it. So that we've become very impatient, I think, and we don't acknowledge the care with which movements have to be built and the skill that's required, the skill of the organizer. And this is something I've been saying probably for about 30 years. And what's interesting is that in most movements, the organizers are women. You see? And that's really, I think it's important to acknowledge the role that women have played, but also we need to recognize that oftentimes organizing, as I've said many times, is considered the housework of the movement, the invisible work, the work that doesn't really matter. But of course, without it, we will not have a movement. So that would be my answer to your question. I think we have to go in vast numbers. And I think even George W. Bush will learn how to listen, or will be compelled to listen, if we could keep up the momentum. I mean, if those 10 million people or 15 million people didn't go home and back into their normal routines, but maintain some kind of a connection, if only a sense of transnational community. We feel so alone. We go out and participate in the demonstration, and for a moment, we feel like we're together, but we go home, and we don't know how to take those feelings with us. We don't know how to take those feelings of solidarity with us so that they nourish us and assist us to do the kind of work that's going to be necessary if we are going to bring about a change in this world.
For two more questions.
Professor Davis, my question to you is, in terms of thinking of the global prison system or industrial system, the fact that the United States has a disproportionate number of prisoners, what does this tell us about this global system?
Okay. Well, there are a number of ways I could approach that question. First of all, I would say that the racialized character of prison populations in this country, that racialized character does not belong only to the United States of America. In post-colonial Europe, I mean, you go to a city like Stockholm and you go to the prison, and who do you find? You find immigrants, Africans, people from the Middle East. You go into prisons in the Netherlands, and you find what we call people of color. So it's not just the structure of the institution. It's not just the regime, and you know, in Turkey, about 100 people have died protesting the imposition of U.S.-style prison architecture and regime on Turkish prisoners. So the U.S.-style prison is being globally marketed. In many countries where people were not, even in a place like Brazil, Giuliani went over to Rosario in Argentina, for example, and brought his zero tolerance program. And then Brazil, and then South Africa, so that there is a marketing of the ideologies as well. And that is what frightens me even more. Because the ideology that developed in the 80s when Reagan was governor, the anti-crime rhetoric that developed in conjunction with the dismantling of the welfare state and the privatization of health care, the privatization, this is when the private prison companies began, those approaches have been globalized. And so now, what do you do when you have social problems in a community, a state, a nation? What do you do when people aren't getting an education? What do you do when there's illiteracy? What do you do when people aren't getting health care, when they're not getting mental health care? The solution that emerged in the 80s put them in prison. And that idea has been globalized, even in a country like South Africa. I have visited prisons in South Africa, and I feel horrendously bad about the extent to which we have allowed this country to emerge as the leader in the market for punishment. And you better believe that the so-called war on terror is related to all of that. Because the figure of the terrorist was developed on the heels of the ideological development of the figure of the criminal. Both are racialized. We talk about the criminal and the terrorist in the same way, and they both bear very interesting similarities to the anti-communist rhetoric, the way in which the communist was represented during the McCarthy era, the 60s, the early 70s, as the enemy and as the pretext for the military acceleration and so forth. Does that make any sense? Okay. That's my answer.
Got it? Okay. This may more relate to your scholarship than a question of immediate interest. That Tocqueville, taking you back, that Tocqueville, when he came to America, you see where I'm going, right? His intent was to study the prison system of America, right? That was his original intent. But because his program on the French Parliament had abolished slavery in the islands, the members, would you like me to continue? You would like me to continue, right? You know where I'm headed, right? She's laughing. consciousness speaking, do you think that Tocqueville was aware of the connection between prison and democracy?
Okay. The question has to do, okay, most people know democracy in America, right? By de Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, right? Okay, the point that the questioner was making was that when de Tocqueville came to this country and ended up doing research that resulted in that 2-volume study that everybody is forced to read on democracy in America. And there's some interesting things in it. I'm not suggesting that it shouldn't be read. I read it. He came on a commission by the French government with Beaumont to investigate the new institution called the American Penitentiary. And so much of the time he spent in this country was spent visiting prisons. And as a matter of fact, Tocqueville and Beaumont produced a report to the French government on the possible application of the American penitentiary in France. So the question, it seems to me, has to do with this idea that the United States of America bears major responsibility for the dissemination of this particular form of punishment, not only in Europe, but all over Asia. If we look at the process of colonization, how the prison accompanied colonization as one of the major democratic institutions. So the question you ask about the relationship between the penitentiary and democracy is a very apt one. If I had time, I would talk at greater length about the extent to which the institution of the penitentiary is both deeply democratic and at the same time anti-democratic. It militates against democracy. It's based on democratic notions, but it militates against democracy. You know, there was someone upstairs who just one.
Well, we can actually get what's going to ask you.
Two more? Two more, okay. Two. Wait.
Yeah, I want to. Okay.
Okay, I'll see if I can be brief.
Okay, due to the fact that black women are going to prison at an alarming rate, what is one way to modify the Black Power strategy to empower the black woman to take charge, since black men have not yet stood up publicly for the black woman or the black family for that matter?
Okay. Well, you know, I don't know if we can talk in terms of absolutes anymore. We have a sense that there is this thing called the black community, or there is the black man and there's the black woman. But as a matter of fact, black communities are extremely heterogeneous, and right here in South Florida, you should know that more than anyone else. You can't talk about a unitary black community. But to answer your question, I mean, that's not to say that I don't think that there's some truth in the question that you ask, and that has to do with the extent to which historically and today there's been less recognition of the particular issues that bring race and gender together by communities other than communities of women. So what does this mean? It means that, yes, black men and all men have to stand up against domestic violence, for example, and have to recognize, you know, one of the things I would have said if I had had more time was that in this relationship between the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex, violence against women is a thread. It's a theme. It is, when you think about violence against women in what I would call a privatized realm. We talk about the family. We talk about intimate relationships. That's usually how we think about violence against women nowadays, right? Even though it's a relatively new notion, violence against women. But when we say violence against women, we immediately think about battering and rape in the context of personal and private or privatized relationships. I think it's important to think about violence against women in prison. The strip search, for example, that happens to women all over the world, every single ever. And so it means that women have to learn how to think in those terms, but so do men. What about the violence against women that's perpetrated by the military? Think about rape that happens under the guise of military occupation. How many women in Iraq are being raped by U.S. troops right now? So I think it's not so much about the black man and the black woman, because the creature doesn't exist, right? But it is about learning how to challenge the things we most take for granted. It's about learning how to think critically and to begin to disentangle ourselves from all of these ideologies of male dominance and homophobia and class bias and racism. We walk around with all of these ideas in our heads all the time. And we think they are our own ideas. We don't even realize that when we think we are thinking, we are being thought, by the discourses and the ideologies that shape us. So I think that's the most important thing. And for me, it's not so much a question of your identity, your racial identity, your sexual identity, or whatever. What's more important is how you think about these questions. Because Ward Connolly, who is a black man, who's responsible for the attack on affirmative action, he's not a part of any kind of progressive community. So let's stop trying to include all of these people together. Let's use political criteria. Let's think about community building in a different way.
Joan.
That's true. Let's do one more. Let's get a woman. Let's do one more question. Just one more. Let's see. Okay.
Dr. Davis, the word diaspora is a key word for this particular program in South Florida. And with the colorization of the planet and the disinterest of the political power for the voice of the American people, and with our own, I'm trying to get the right word, obsession with material things above and beyond the right to speech, the right to be heard, the right to say no to vouchers, the right to say no to the fact that our children are being tracked for prison, the right to say no to the fact that we can't discipline our children. It's illegal to discipline our children so that they become prisoners, they become criminals. Where does it stop that our voices are, when are our voices going to be heard? When are the American people's voices going to be heard that, no, we don't want war, No, we don't want vouchers. No, we don't want our children in prison. Yes, we want to be able to discipline our. How do we get that message across?
Well, I've been talking about building movements. And since this lecture is in honor of Eric Williams, we might evoke once again the example of slavery and consider how long it took to build a movement that had any significant impact on the future of slavery. And then consider how, we forget sometimes. We forget that not that much time has passed since black people were not even allowed to vote in this state. We are, I like to work with history because I'm persuaded that we live out those histories that we are convinced only exist in the past. We are living those histories today in a country where everyone is encouraged to be completely unaware of the impact of history. Historical amnesia is what America is all about. So that I would suggest that what you're talking about are the challenges of building a movement. And it's not, it's not, as I said, it's not just about the demonstrations. It's about reaching organized groups of people. It's about reaching the church. It's about involving the labor movement. One of the major challenges of this movement against the prison industrial complex is to get the union movement involved. Is to get the labor movement involved. Prisoners have been trying to organize labor movements for as long as prisons have existed. And there does not exist a single labor movement in a single penitentiary, in a single prison in this country. So, let's think about what we can do that's going to have an impact on the long run. That's not just this, instantaneous satisfaction that we seek. And it requires a little patience. But it also requires getting all kinds of people involved, like artists. It seems to me that young people today are more influenced by music, by spoken word artists, than by anything else. And so, how do you imagine art doing the kind of work that will encourage critical thinking? Because see, that's, like I said, that's what I think it's all about. Learning how to question that which we most take for granted. Learning how to question those things that we normally don't question. And if we learn how to do that, then I think there's some hope. There's some hope for the future. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much. Once again, let's have a hand of applause for Angela. Thank you.